A clap of thunder split the pitch-dark night sky, as if screaming in protest at the cruelty unfolding in a modest house on the outskirts of town. Rain poured relentlessly, creating a curtain of water that obscured vision, yet not thick enough to drown out the furious shouts of a man consumed by rage. The front door of the house slammed shut, its hinges groaning in agony. A frail figure was roughly shoved out, almost tumbling onto the wet, slick porch. Grace struggled to steady her body, still trembling violently. She clutched a cloth bundle tightly to her chest, shielding it from the rain spray carried by the strong wind. Inside the bundle, her tiny 3-day-old baby cried piercingly, a heartbreaking sound amidst the storm's roar. David stood at the threshold, his face red with fury, his eyes glaring at his wife, who now shivered in the rain. Without mercy, David tossed a large bag full of clothes onto the yard. It landed squarely in a mud puddle, instantly soiling some of its contents. Grace stared at the bag numbly, then looked back at her husband, tears already mixing with the rain on her cheeks. The pain in her lower abdomen intensified. The stitches from her C-section, performed just 3 days ago, stung as if being violently pulled apart. Yet the physical pain was nothing compared to the agony in her heart, seeing the man who once promised to protect her now treating her worse than an animal. David screamed, pointing a finger trembling with emotion at Grace's face. He declared he never wanted to see her face again, nor the child she held. David accused her of infidelity, claiming the baby wasn't his blood. He shouted that the baby's face looked nothing like him, but rather like another man he falsely claimed was Grace's lover. The accusation was so vile and baseless, it choked Grace. Grace tried to take a step closer, begging David to listen to her explanation. She swore to God there had never been another man in her life, and that Leo was David's biological son. But every word from Grace's mouth was met with a harsher shout. David covered his ears, refusing to hear anything more. Grace pleaded, not for herself, but for Leo. The baby was too fragile, too new to be in such cold air. Grace begged David for mercy, asking him to let her shelter inside, at least until the rain stopped, or at least let Leo stay indoors. But David's heart was sealed shut, as hard as stone. He slammed the iron gate of their house shut, locking it from the inside. David declared he didn't care if they froze to death out there. To him, Grace and the baby were bad omens that needed to be cast far away. After unleashing his rant, David turned and went back inside, slamming the main door firmly shut. The porch light was extinguished, leaving Grace in total darkness, illuminated only by occasional flashes of lightning. Now Grace was truly alone. Her body was soaked from her head covering to her toes. Her modest dress became heavy from absorbing water, making it even harder to move. She painfully picked up the bag of clothes lying in the mud, slinging it over the shoulder, not supporting her baby's head. With a limp from the pain in her abdomen, Grace began to walk away, leaving the home that had been hers for the past year. Every step felt like torture. The sharp pain in her stomach radiated to her back, forcing her to hunch over to absorb the shock. She continuously whispered comforting words to Leo, who kept crying, promising they would soon find shelter. Though Grace herself didn't know where to go, the suburban street was deserted. Not a single neighbor was out. The heavy rain kept everyone curled up in their warm beds, unaware of a young mother struggling desperately outside. Grace walked along the broken sidewalk. Occasionally, her foot stumbled on a rock or plunged into a cold puddle. She had no cash. Her wallet was left inside the house, and David hadn't allowed her to take anything but old clothes. Her phone was dead, its battery drained. She was completely cut off from the outside world. Dire thoughts began to haunt her. What if her surgical stitches burst open? What if Leo got hypothermia? The fear spurred her on, even though her legs felt like they would break. After walking for almost a mile, Grace reached the wider, yet still quiet, main road. The dim streetlights made the atmosphere even more ominous. Cars rarely passed, and if they did, they sped by, oblivious to pedestrians. Grace felt her head begin to pound, her vision blurred from exhaustion, hunger, and unbearable pain. She hadn't eaten since noon, busy with a fussy Leo. Now, her energy was completely depleted. She was about to give up, intending to sit on an empty bus bench just to rest her legs. But then she remembered the night wind was bad for her baby. She had to keep moving to generate warmth. Suddenly, a bright car headlight shone on her from behind. Grace moved to the side, assuming the car would just pass. But the car slowed. A gleaming black luxury sedan slowly crept alongside her, matching Grace's halting pace. Grace's heart pounded. She feared it was a malicious person with ill intentions. In the dead of night, in a rainstorm like this, who would stop for a stranger? Grace tightened her embrace on Leo and tried to quicken her steps, despite her limp. But the car continued to follow, eventually stopping a few feet ahead, blocking her path. The rear passenger door slowly opened. Grace stepped back, wary. From inside the car emerged an elderly woman, looking very distinguished. Despite her advanced age, the woman paid no mind to the rain, instantly soaking her expensive clothes. She walked towards Grace with an unreadable gaze. There was determination, but also a maternal warmth in her eyes. The elderly woman asked in a voice loud enough to overcome the sound of the rain why Grace was walking alone in such a state. The question was simple, yet it broke Grace's already fractured composure. With lips trembling from cold and tears, Grace answered truthfully. She said her husband had just thrown her out. She briefly recounted how her husband accused her newborn child of being illegitimate and a bad omen, though it wasn't true. Grace had no strength left to lie or protect her husband's reputation. She just needed help. Hearing that, the elderly woman's expression changed. There was no exaggerated surprise, as if she had already anticipated such a thing. The elderly woman nodded slowly and then uttered words that stunned Grace. She said that Grace was the person she had been looking for. Without further ado, the woman ordered Grace to get into her car and come with her. She promised to resolve everything tonight. Grace hesitated for a moment. She didn't know this woman. But seeing Leo, who had grown eerily quiet, which was more frightening than his crying, Grace realized she had no choice. She needed a warm place for her child. Grace nodded weakly and allowed the elderly woman to guide her into the warm, luxurious car. What happened next was truly beyond Grace's wildest expectations. The elderly woman didn't just give her a ride. Inside the car, Grace saw stacks of documents on the seat beside her. Her eyes briefly caught sight of David's photo attached to one of the papers. Confusion and fear mixed together, but exhaustion slowly dulled her senses as her body met the soft leather seats. Grace didn't know that this meeting was no coincidence, and tonight would be the longest night that would change her life forever. The air inside the luxury sedan was a stark contrast to the outside, warm, dry, and scented with a calming fragrance. Grace leaned back weakly on the soft leather seat. A stern-faced man in the front passenger seat immediately handed her a clean, dry, thick towel. Grace took it with trembling hands. Then she quickly dried Leo first. The tiny baby stirred gently, feeling the warmth once again envelop his body. After ensuring Leo was safe, Grace then dried her face and wet head covering. The elderly woman sitting beside her watched intently. Her gaze was sharp, but no longer as intimidating as it had been on the street. The elderly woman introduced herself as Mrs. Eleanor Vance. She wasted no time on pleasantries. With a concise and authoritative tone, she began to explain things that made Grace's head throb with confusion. Mrs. Vance said she knew exactly who David, Grace's husband, was. She explained that David was not as good a man as Grace believed. Mrs. Vance then opened a first aid kit available in the car, taking out antiseptic and bandages. She knew Grace was in pain. Without any sign of disgust, Mrs. Vance helped Grace clean a scratch on her hand from where she had been pushed. While Grace remained silent, trying to process the woman's words, Mrs. Vance then revealed a shocking fact. The reason David threw Grace out tonight wasn't merely due to a momentary emotional outburst or false accusations of an illegitimate child. All of that was just a fabricated excuse to remove Grace from the house. The real reason was that David needed to be single tonight. Mrs. Vance informed her that at this very moment, David was on his way to a lavish event venue downtown. A grand party was being held there, not just any party, but a celebration of his business success, and simultaneously David's engagement party to a woman named Chloe. Grace felt her heart stop for a moment. Chloe. She had never heard that name. All this time, David had always come home on time, always acted sweet, even though lately he had been frequently agitated about money. Grace never suspected there was another woman. Tears fell again. This time, not from physical pain, but from the profound betrayal. Mrs. Vance handed her a tissue and firmly stated that Grace's tears were too precious to be shed over a man like David. She said that Chloe was the daughter of a business associate whom David claimed would bring huge profits to his ventures. David cast aside Grace and their child because he saw them as obstacles to his ambition to ascend to a higher social class. The car sped through the rain towards downtown. Grace asked in a hoarse voice, "Where are they going exactly?" Mrs. Vance answered simply that they were going to the party. Grace was shocked and refused. She felt she wasn't presentable. Look at her wet clothes, pale face, and carrying a new baby. She would be an object of ridicule. She felt dirty and insignificant. However, Mrs. Vance looked deeply into her eyes. She said that tonight, Grace would not come as a victim begging for mercy. Grace would come as a judge passing sentence. Mrs. Vance assured Grace that she had something that could instantly crush David's arrogance. Mrs. Vance took a folder from her briefcase and handed it to Grace. Grace opened it hesitantly. Inside was an old property deed, its paper yellowed with age. Grace read the owner's name listed there. It was her deceased father's name. Grace was confused. She knew her father had only left a small house, long sold to pay for her mother's medical treatment. Mrs. Vance explained that the land described in the deed was no ordinary land. It was a vast plot upon which now stood the very event venue where David's party was being held, and also the land where David's house stood. All this time, those documents had been hidden and manipulated by David's family without Grace's knowledge, as she was a child and an orphan then. This truth hit Grace hard, blow after blow. All this time she had been living as a dependent on her own land, treated like trash by someone who had stolen her rights. Sadness slowly turned to anger. Mrs. Vance smiled subtly, seeing the change in Grace's expression. That was what she hoped for. She didn't need a weak woman who could only cry. She needed a strong woman ready to reclaim her rights. Mrs. Vance then pressed an intercom button, instructing the driver to speed up. She told Grace they had to arrive before David slipped the ring onto Chloe's finger. Moments later, the car turned into the lavish, crystal-lit lobby area of a magnificent building. Outside the lobby, luxury cars belonging to the invited guests lined up. The security guards at the entrance attentively waved off unauthorized vehicles. But upon seeing Mrs. Vance's sedan approach, their demeanor changed dramatically. They bowed respectfully, even jogging to open the car door, ignoring other guests waiting in line. Grace felt nervous. She looked at her clothes, still slightly damp despite being dried as best as possible. Mrs. Vance patted Grace's hand, giving her strength. In the back seat, a box of fresh clothes had been prepared. Mrs. Vance told Grace to change in the spacious car with the windows completely curtained. Grace put on a simple but elegant long dress and a clean new head covering. There was no flashy jewelry, yet Grace's aura was completely transformed. Her pale face now conveyed a cold, mysterious impression. Mrs. Vance nodded with satisfaction. She called her assistant to bring a wheelchair from the car's trunk. Grace was still too weak to walk far, and Mrs. Vance wanted to ensure Grace entered with her head held high, not tottering. As the automatic lobby doors opened, the faint sound of a piano orchestra drifted from the main ballroom. Mrs. Vance signaled her assistant to push Grace's wheelchair. Grace clutched Leo, who was now sound asleep in a warm, thick blanket. Her heart pounded as the wheelchair's wheels rolled across the polished marble floor. At the end of the corridor, the double doors to the main ballroom stood shut. Behind those doors, David was laughing happily, oblivious to the suffering of his wife and child. Mrs. Vance walked beside Grace, her steps firm and confident. She whispered one last sentence before the doors opened. "Remember, Grace, you own this place. Don't bow your head to a thief." The uniformed doormen promptly opened the grand double doors wide, and the bright light from within the room instantly dazzled Grace's eyes, signaling the beginning of a new chapter in her life. The atmosphere inside the party hall was festive and filled with dazzling luxury. A gigantic crystal chandelier cast golden light throughout the room, reflecting off the polished marble floor that resembled a mirror. Guests, a mix of David's business associates and distant relatives, enjoyed the delicious food served on long tables draped with silk cloths. The clinking of glasses and soft chatter filled the air, creating an atmosphere of seemingly flawless joy. In the center of the room, David stood confidently on a small stage in an expensive suit he had just bought yesterday. Next to him stood Chloe, the woman destined to be his new fiancée, graceful in a shimmering evening gown. David raised his drink glass high, his face beaming with triumph, as if the world was in his grasp. David began his welcoming speech with a loud, confident voice. He spoke of his latest business successes and brilliant future plans. With a wide smile, he also alluded to a major decision he had recently made, cleansing his life of past burdens that hindered his path to success. He subtly hinted at his previous marriage, which he regarded as a mistake, calling Grace a parasite who only brought trouble without contributing anything. The unaware guests nodded in agreement, chuckling along as David spewed jokes disparaging his ex-wife. Chloe smiled sweetly beside him, holding David's arm intimately, as if confirming she was the woman fit to accompany David at the peak of his success. However, the laughter and applause abruptly ceased when the grand double doors at the end of the room burst open with a loud thud. All eyes instantly turned towards the entrance. The orchestra's music slowly faded to a halt, replaced by an eerie silence. In the doorway, a sight starkly contrasted with the party's grandeur appeared. Grace sat in a wheelchair, pushed by a stern-faced assistant. Despite her pale face and swollen eyes, Grace held her head high. She wore the simple yet elegant long dress gifted by Mrs. Vance, complete with a neatly tied head covering. In her lap, Leo slept soundly in a thick, warm blanket, undisturbed by the tension that began to fill the room. David, on stage, gasped in shock. The glass in his hand nearly slipped. His face, previously flushed with joy, turned ghost white in an instant. He hadn't expected Grace to appear here. In his imagination, Grace should be crying by the roadside, drenched in suffering. Grace's presence here, looking far better than when he had thrown her out, made David's blood boil. He felt humiliated. How could the woman he had just discarded like trash dare show her face at the most important event of his life? Panic began to spread through David's chest. He feared his cruel secret would be exposed before the business associates he had always deceived with an image of a good husband. With hurried steps, David descended the stage and walked towards Grace with a fierce glare. He tried to mask his panic with explosive anger. His voice boomed, filling the room, accusing Grace of being a crazy, shameless woman. He shouted to the guests that the woman in the wheelchair was a beggar trying to disrupt his party. David pointed at Grace, scolding her to leave immediately before he called the police. He even dared to say that the child Grace carried was the result of a disgusting illicit affair, attempting to build a narrative that would make the guests view Grace with disgust. Chloe, left on stage, looked confused but remained quiet, her eyes hinting at something unreadable. Seeing Grace remain silent and stare at him with a cold gaze, David's emotions became uncontrollable. He turned around and loudly called for the building's head of security. A powerfully built man in a full security uniform immediately ran over. David smiled victoriously, confident that Grace would soon be forcibly dragged out and humiliated in public. David ordered the head of security to immediately throw Grace and her baby onto the street, just as he had done at home. He even added that they shouldn't be allowed to shelter on the building's porch for a moment. David felt he had full authority in that place because he was the main tenant for the night. However, what happened next left David and all the guests gawking in disbelief. The head of security did not move towards Grace to drag her away. Instead, the brawny man walked past David as if David were worthless. The head of security stopped directly in front of Grace's wheelchair, then bowed deeply with utmost respect. He welcomed Grace in a firm and polite voice, addressing her as the esteemed owner of the building. The head of security's voice was clearly audible in the silent room, like a bolt of lightning, on a clear day for David. David froze, his mouth slightly ajar from shock. He tried to process what he had just heard. The owner of the building? Grace? It was impossible. Grace was just a poor orphan who had nothing. David let out a hollow laugh, trying to deny reality. He shouted at the head of security that he must be mistaken or insane. He claimed he had paid handsomely to rent the building and had the right to kick anyone out. However, David's laughter ceased when Mrs. Vance emerged from behind Grace's wheelchair. The elderly woman walked proudly, holding a dragon-carved wooden cane. Mrs. Vance looked at David with a disdainful gaze, as if seeing dirt on the tip of her shoe. In a calm yet authoritative voice, Mrs. Vance explained the hidden truth. She stated that this land and building stood on the legitimate deed of Grace's family, which had been embezzled by David's deceased father. Tonight, all proof of ownership had returned to its rightful hands. Mrs. Vance challenged David in front of everyone, asking mockingly, "Who is truly infringing here? Who is truly the parasite living off other people's wealth?" David's face flushed with shame and anger. His position had completely reversed. From a boastful host, he was now merely an unwelcome guest on property belonging to the wife he had just expelled. The realization that Grace was the legitimate owner of the luxurious building where he stood made David lose face. Murmurs among the guests grew loud, like buzzing bees. They began to look at David with suspicion and contempt. The reputation as a successful businessman that David had built over years now threatened to crumble in minutes. David realized he couldn't dispute the building's ownership because Mrs. Vance seemed so certain and was supported by the head of security. Therefore, David decided to attack from another angle, an angle he believed would utterly destroy Grace's dignity. The status of baby Leo in Grace's arms. David returned to the stage, snatching the microphone from the bewildered MC's hand. Breathing heavily, he screamed loudly, trying to divert everyone's attention from the building issue. He pointed at Leo, still sleeping in Grace's lap. David declared that wealth and buildings could not cover up the fact that Grace was an adulterous woman. He repeated his accusation that Leo was an illegitimate child. With a flourish, David pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his suit pocket. He claimed it was the result of a medical examination from a renowned doctor stating that he had been permanently sterile since a car accident 5 years ago. David held the paper high, showing it to the guests. He argued in a feigned, trembling voice, as if he were the most suffering victim. He asked the audience, how could Grace be pregnant and give birth if her husband is sterile? The only explanation, according to David's twisted logic, was that Grace had slept with another man. The accusation was so vile and explicit that several female guests covered their mouths in shock. Grace, hearing the slander, could only lower her head, hugging Leo even tighter. Her tears fell again, not because she was guilty, but because she never imagined the man she once loved could be so cruel as to slander his own flesh and blood merely to save his ego. Seeing Grace silent and tearful, David felt he had the upper hand. He felt he had successfully turned public opinion. He smirked, feeling victorious. However, that smile didn't last long. Mrs. Vance, who had been standing calmly beside Grace's wheelchair, now stepped forward. She signaled her assistant to take another microphone. Mrs. Vance's voice was clear and sharp, cutting through the din. She stated that lies might run fast, but truth would always catch up. Mrs. Vance asked everyone to remain calm and witness the real proof. Without hesitation, Mrs. Vance asked Grace to slightly open the blanket covering Leo. Carefully, Grace uncovered the cloth, revealing the baby's spotless white upper arm. There, precisely on the left shoulder, was a unique birthmark. It was reddish-brown, shaped like a slightly irregular crescent moon. Mrs. Vance requested the projector camera to zoom in on the birthmark so its image was clearly displayed on the large screen behind the stage. All the guests could clearly see the distinctive birthmark. Then Mrs. Vance turned towards David, who still stood on stage. With a commanding tone that could not be defied, she ordered David to roll up his left sleeve. David flatly refused, hiding his hand behind his back. His face began to sweat profusely. He shouted that this was a violation of privacy, and he would not obey the crazy old woman's command. However, Mrs. Vance was undeterred. She signaled 2 large security officers to come onto the stage. David struggled, squirming, as the 2 officers held his arms. The sight was utterly humiliating, a party host grappling with security at his own event. But David's strength was no match. The security officers managed to restrain David and forcibly rolled up his suit sleeve and expensive shirt to his shoulder. The next moment, the entire room gasped. Sounds of shock emanated simultaneously from the guests' mouths. On David's left shoulder, in the exact same spot as Leo, was an identical crescent-shaped birthmark. Its shape, color, and position were all precisely the same, as if a mold had been duplicated. Mrs. Vance smiled triumphantly. She explained to everyone through the microphone that this birthmark was a very strong and rare genetic trait passed down directly from father to male child. It was a natural DNA proof that could not be falsified by any paid medical papers. Mrs. Vance then looked at David, who was now limp and helpless in the security officer's grasp. She revealed a medical fact that David had never known. The sterility diagnosis David had believed was actually a false diagnosis from a doctor who had once tried to extort him. In reality, David had been completely cured a year ago, without his knowledge. Mrs. Vance's words pierced David's heart more sharply than any knife. David stared at the birthmark on his arm, then at the large screen displaying Leo's birthmark. The realization hit him hard. The baby he had just cast out into the storm, the baby he had called illegitimate and a bad omen, was truly his biological child, his own flesh and blood, the sole heir to his lineage. David had just disowned and abandoned his own child in front of hundreds of witnesses. Shame, regret, and fear mingled into one, making his knees tremble until he fell to the stage floor. Meanwhile, the guests' gazes now turned into intense looks of disgust. He was not just a deceiver, but also a father who utterly disrespected his own son. Murmurs in the ballroom grew louder, transforming into an angry swarm of bees. The guests, who had previously looked at David with respect, now stared at him with suspicion and intense disgust. The fact that David had just disowned his own flesh and blood in public had shattered the moral pillar he had built up for so long. However, David was not ready to give up. The man rose from the stage floor, dusting off his expensive suit pants with a brusque motion. His flushed face now looked up, trying to defy the judging stares of hundreds of eyes before him. He realized his personal reputation was ruined, but he still had another ace up his sleeve: his wealth. In this world, money could buy anything, including a clean name. Or so he thought. David grabbed the microphone again. His voice trembled with suppressed rage. Yet it was still loud. He shouted at the guests not to fall for the old woman's nonsense. He admitted there might have been a medical error regarding his sterility, but that didn't change the fact that he was a successful businessman who had built everything from scratch. He pounded his chest proudly, declaring that this party was funded by his own hard-earned money, not by inheritance or anyone's handouts. David pointed at Grace, who sat in the wheelchair, with a condescending look. He said that Grace might own the old land deed, but the magnificent building standing on it and the business operating within it were his. Without him, that land would merely be a worthless, empty lot. He warned the investors present in the room that if they sided with Grace, they would lose their most profitable business partner. Mrs. Vance listened to David's rambling with a calm face, as if listening to a boring bedtime story. When David finished speaking, Mrs. Vance did not waste time arguing. She simply gave a small signal to her assistant standing near the AV technician. The large screen behind the stage, which had previously displayed Leo's birthmark, flickered and changed. A gigantic financial graph appeared, showing sharp red lines plummeting downwards. It was the financial statement of David's company. The figures displayed were shocking. The profit column was completely empty, while the debt column had swollen to hundreds of millions of dollars. The guests, mostly business associates, gasped in shock at seeing the confidential data laid bare. Mrs. Vance stepped forward, taking command of the stage with her strong charisma. She explained in a loud voice that what David boasted as a business empire was actually just a Ponzi scheme. The investments David had paraded all this time were merely revolving funds from new debts used to pay off old ones. David's lavish lifestyle, the gleaming luxury car, branded watches, and tonight's party were all funded by loans he would never be able to repay. David froze, his face paling. His company's dirty laundry, which he had so tightly guarded, was now exposed to the public. He tried to shout protests that the data was fake, but Mrs. Vance immediately cut him off with an even more painful truth. The next fact made Grace, sitting in the wheelchair, gasp sharply. Mrs. Vance revealed that David was incredibly cunning in concealing his bankruptcy. Because David's credit record was already poor with banks, he had used someone else's name to apply for new loans totaling astronomical amounts. And that person was Grace. The projector screen changed, displaying copies of credit agreement documents. Clearly stated there was Grace's name as the primary borrower and full guarantor for these debts. Grace's signature was on every page of the documents. Grace covered her mouth with her hands, her body trembling. She remembered. Months ago, when she was heavily pregnant and often unwell, David frequently gave her stacks of papers to sign, claiming they were for household administration or routine banking matters. Grace, who fully trusted her husband at the time, signed everything without reading. Mrs. Vance looked at Grace with a mix of pity and sternness, informing her that her husband had not only abandoned her, but also planned to throw her in jail due to these debts. David had deliberately piled up debt in Grace's name, then divorced her so that when the collectors came, David could wash his hands of it, and Grace would be dragged to court. The evil plan was so meticulous and cruel. Grace felt her chest tighten, not from illness, but from the pain of betrayal by the person she trusted most. David was not just a bad husband. He was a criminal who would sacrifice his own wife and child to save his own skin. The party atmosphere turned chaotic. Investors who realized their money was gone began shouting angrily, surging towards the stage. They demanded an explanation from David. David recoiled in fear, cold sweat beading on his forehead. He was cornered. At the same time, a side door to the ballroom opened. Two uniformed police officers walked in with firm steps, followed by a neatly dressed man in a suit carrying a stack of files. The man was the bank's lawyer who had been pursuing David. The police officer went onto the stage and read out an arrest warrant, not for domestic violence, but for fraud, embezzlement, and falsifying banking documents. David shook his head in panic, trying to find an escape route, but his way out was already blocked by the anger of the people he had cheated. In a state of extreme panic, cornered from all sides, David's wild survival instinct kicked in. He frantically looked around, searching for anyone who could save him from this fatal situation. His eyes landed on a beautiful woman standing not far from him on the stage. Chloe, his fiancée, the woman he had boasted about as the daughter of a high-ranking official with extensive connections. David was convinced that with Chloe's father's influence, these police officers could be stopped, or at least he could get a stay of detention. David immediately ran towards Chloe, roughly grasping her arm in his panic. He desperately begged Chloe to call her father and fix this mess. David promised to explain everything later and swore that all of Mrs. Vance's accusations were mere slander. However, Chloe's response was completely unexpected. She did not appear panicked or sad. Her beautiful face, usually adorned with a sweet smile, had now turned cold and flat, as hard as ice. With a calm yet forceful motion, Chloe shook off David's hand gripping her arm. She looked at David with undisguised disgust. Chloe stepped back, maintaining her distance as if David were a contagious disease. David gasped, confused by the sudden change in demeanor of the woman who had, just hours ago, whispered intimately in his ear. He asked in a hoarse voice why Chloe remained silent while her fiancé was being treated unfairly. Without saying a word to David, Chloe turned and walked towards Mrs. Vance and Grace. The sound of Chloe's high heels echoed sharply on the silent stage. Upon reaching Mrs. Vance, Chloe slightly bowed her head, offering a very polite greeting. Then she rummaged through her small, sparkling handbag, pulling out a small silver object, a flash drive. Chloe handed the device to Mrs. Vance. The scene left David and all guests speechless. David's mind raced, trying to understand the connection between his fiancée and his archenemy. Mrs. Vance accepted the flash drive with a subtle smile, then looked at David, who was still stunned. She then introduced who Chloe truly was. Chloe was not the daughter of an official, as David had boasted. Chloe's father was merely a retired ordinary teacher in a small town. Chloe was a professional private detective, specifically hired by Mrs. Vance 6 months ago. Chloe's mission was to infiltrate David's life, make him fall in love, and gather all evidence of his business crimes and wicked plans from close range. All of Chloe's charade of love, extravagant engagement, and sweet promises were merely a mousetrap meticulously laid to ensnare David at the peak of his arrogance. David felt his knees buckle as he fell to the floor again. His entire romance for the past 6 months had been a fabrication. He felt exposed. Chloe then took the microphone. Her voice was firm and formal, vastly different from the coy voice she usually used with David. Chloe revealed one more horrifying fact. Inside David's briefcase in the VIP changing room was a small packet containing illicit drugs. Chloe explained that the drugs were not for David's consumption, but were prepared by David to be planted in Grace's bag. His plan, after throwing Grace out, was to report her to the police on charges of drug possession, ensuring Grace rotted in jail and child custody fell to the state or an orphanage, thus freeing David from any responsibility for child support forever. Chloe's confession ignited a roar in the room. Guests gasped in horror. Financial crimes might be forgivable to some, but planning to frame the mother of his own child with narcotics was an unforgivable, devilish act. Grace, hearing the vicious plan, could only hug Leo even tighter. Her tears streamed down her face from fear, imagining what would have happened if Mrs. Vance had not come to her aid tonight. She might already be languishing in a cold jail cell, separated from her nursing baby. Chloe then played a voice recording from her phone over the building's loudspeakers. David's voice was clearly heard, laughing as he spoke to someone on the phone about his plan to dispose of the trash, referring to Grace, and how he had already bought evidence to frame his wife. The voice was unmistakable. David, now kneeling on the stage floor, looked like a madman who had lost his mind. His face was ghostly pale, his eyes darting wildly around. He realized there was no escape. Chloe, the woman he thought was his trophy, was in fact the executioner placing the noose around his neck. The police, who were already on stage, immediately moved toward David. Metal handcuffs were produced, reflecting the glaring spotlights. David retreated, scrambling, shaking his head hysterically. He screamed that it was all a trap, that he was innocent. However, the evidence presented by Chloe was more than sufficient. Mrs. Vance watched the scene with satisfaction. She softly told Grace that this was how evil people were destroyed, not with violence, but by letting them dig their own graves through their greed and lies. The engagement party, which was supposed to be David's coronation as a business king, had turned into an execution stage for his dignity. David was truly alone, betrayed by his own ambition, and surrounded by enemies he had created. The situation inside the magnificent event hall turned chaotic within seconds. David felt the world around him collapse on him. Chloe, the woman he thought would be his savior, had become the one who placed the noose around his neck. Uniformed police officers began to move forward, parting the terrified crowd of guests. The sound of their boots echoed sharply on the marble floor, as if counting down the remaining moments of David's freedom. David backed away slowly, his eyes darting wildly, searching for an escape route. But the main exit was tightly guarded by the building's security personnel. His breath hitched, cold sweat pouring down his pale face. He knew that if he was caught now, he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, rotting among criminals he might have defrauded before. In mounting panic, David's gaze fell upon a fruit buffet table not far from where he stood. A sharp silver knife, used for slicing fruit, lay there. His cunning mind worked rapidly. Driven by a desperate, blind instinct for survival, David snatched the knife without a second thought. His move was so sudden that the approaching police reflexively paused, drawing their weapons. Guests shrieked hysterically at the glint of metal in David's hand. However, David's target was not the police. His eyes were fixed on a much softer and more valuable target, something he could use as leverage to escape this hell. On the side of the stage, a female assistant, Mrs. Vance's trusted employee, stood holding a thick cloth bundle containing a baby. Grace, seated in her wheelchair, was right beside her. David screamed loudly, his voice cracking with hysteria, ordering everyone to step back. With a desperate lunge, he charged towards the assistant. Before anyone could react, David grabbed the assistant's arm, roughly yanked her body, and snatched the baby bundle from her embrace. The assistant shrieked in shock, but David had already retreated, backing himself against the stage wall while holding the silver knife directly against the cloth bundle in his left arm. Grace shrieked hysterically at the sight. Her weak body seemed to receive a surge of new energy from overwhelming fear. She tried to rise from her wheelchair, but her legs were still too painful to support her, causing her to fall back weakly. David grinned maniacally, seeing the fear in Grace's eyes. He felt he was back in control. In a loud voice that echoed throughout the room, David threatened to harm the baby if the police dared to take one more step. He demanded a car with a full tank of gas be provided at the front lobby, and a clear path out, free of obstacles. He swore he would not hesitate to stab the baby if his demands were not met within 5 minutes. The room fell into a tense, ominous silence. No one dared to speak. The police slightly lowered their weapons, attempting to negotiate so David wouldn't act rashly. Grace sobbed, begging David not to hurt Leo. Mrs. Vance, standing not far from Grace, raised her hand, signaling the police to hold back. The elderly woman's face looked strained, but her eyes remained fixed on David. David felt triumphant. He saw fear on everyone's faces. He thought this crazy strategy had worked. He began to slowly move towards a side exit, dragging his feet, continuously holding the knife towards the baby in his arms. But amidst the tension, David noticed something odd. The baby in his arms was completely still. There was no sound of crying, no squirming as a disturbed baby would. Yet he had just snatched it roughly, and the surrounding atmosphere was very noisy. The bundle felt stiff, and a little too heavy for a newborn baby just a few days old. A sense of suspicion began to creep into David's mind. He lowered his head slightly, peeking under the thick cloth that enveloped the tiny figure. His heart seemed to stop as his eyes caught what he was actually holding. It wasn't Leo. It wasn't a human baby. Beneath the expensive blanket was the face of a silicon doll, remarkably similar to a real baby, complete with closed eyes and realistic skin. A high-quality reborn doll often used for therapy or collections. David gasped, his breath caught in his throat. He had been completely fooled. Mrs. Vance had anticipated David's madness. From the very beginning of the commotion, the real baby, Leo, had been secured and moved out through the back exit by another caretaker to a tightly guarded VIP room. What was near the stage was merely bait to induce David's carelessness. This realization shattered David's concentration instantly. His hand gripping the knife trembled violently from shock. That moment of distraction was not wasted by Grace. Seeing David frozen, staring at the doll, a furious mother's instinct overruled her physical pain. Grace saw Mrs. Vance's dragon-carved wooden cane leaning against a table near her wheelchair. With the last of her strength, Grace snatched the heavy cane, rose with all her might, ignoring the pain in her abdominal stitches, and swung the cane as hard as she could towards David's hand. The sickening thud of hardwood meeting bone echoed. The cane struck David's wrist squarely. David shrieked in pain. The knife in his hand flew through the air, clattering onto the marble floor. He lost his balance and fell sprawling. The doll slipped from his embrace, rolling helplessly. Before David could even get up, 3 police officers and the building's head of security pounced on him. They pressed David's body to the floor, locked his hands behind his back, and snapped the metal handcuffs shut with a satisfying click. David thrashed like a trapped wild animal, but his resistance was futile. He had been utterly defeated, humiliated, and was now officially a prisoner. David was now powerless. His face pressed against the cold floor, pinned by the knees of the security officers restraining him. His breath came in ragged gasps, a mixture of physical pain and mental devastation. His lavish engagement party had transformed into a crime scene. The guests still stood frozen, witnessing a family drama more horrifying than any soap opera. David lifted his head slightly. His eyes, red with rage and tears of frustration, stared intently at Mrs. Vance. The elderly woman walked closer with slow, deliberate steps, accompanied by the tapping sound of her wooden cane, which was now back in her hand. Grace, exhausted after hitting David, was helped back into her wheelchair by Chloe. Her breathing was still ragged, but her eyes shone with satisfaction. David screamed hoarsely at Mrs. Vance, asking who she really was. He cursed, accusing Mrs. Vance of being a crazy woman meddling in his family affairs simply to destroy his life. David insisted he had never had dealings with this wealthy woman before. He was sure he had no enemies among the elite. Why was this woman so determined, so planned, and so cruel in ruining him? The question echoed in the silent room. David demanded an answer, feeling entitled to know the reason behind his downfall. Mrs. Vance stopped directly in front of David's prostrate face. She gestured to the security officers to help David sit up, giving him a little space to speak, but still restraining him from escaping. Mrs. Vance looked intently into David's face, a gaze filled with old, unhealed wounds. Slowly, Mrs. Vance raised her hand, touching her own cheek, which bore a faint burn scar near her ear. She asked in a trembling voice, "Does David truly not recognize his own mother's face? Or has David's heart been so blinded by wealth that he has forgotten the womb that bore him?" David froze. His eyes widened, the word mother striking his consciousness like a sledgehammer. He shook his head, refusing to believe it. His mother was a poor, messy, sickly woman he had abandoned 5 years ago in a cheap nursing home on the outskirts of town. His mother was old and frail. It was impossible for her to transform into this high society woman, owner of this luxury building. David let out a hollow laugh, saying Mrs. Vance was lying. He claimed his mother was dead, or perhaps rotting, in that home. The cruel confession tumbled out of David's mouth, making the guests gasp in horror at how filial he was. Mrs. Vance shed tears, yet her face remained resolute. She began to recount the story she had buried deep within for so long. 5 years ago, David had indeed abandoned her. David had falsified his mother's death records so he could claim to be an orphan in order to marry his first wealthy wife before Grace. David was ashamed to have a mother who was a former housemaid, but God had other plans. The nursing home where David had discarded her suffered a massive fire a year after David left. Many perished, but Mrs. Vance survived. She was rescued by a distant relative from her husband's family, who had ironically been searching for them for decades. This relative had no offspring and bequeathed all his wealth to Mrs. Vance before he passed, hoping Mrs. Vance could live a decent life in her remaining years. With her new wealth, Mrs. Vance underwent reconstructive surgery to heal her burn scars, changing her appearance, and learned to become a respectable woman. But her only goal was one: to find her only son. She wanted to forgive David. She wanted to embrace her child. But what she found was truly heartbreaking. She found David, who had become a master con artist, tormenting Grace, his kind daughter-in-law. Mrs. Vance witnessed firsthand how David treated Grace. She hired a detective, infiltrated Chloe, and meticulously orchestrated all of this, not out of hatred, but to deliver the harshest lesson to a son who had lost his conscience. Mrs. Vance bent down slightly, bringing her face level with David's. In a soft voice that could only be heard by those near the stage, she said that she blessed Grace and Leo, her biological grandson. But for David, he no longer had a place. Mrs. Vance firmly stated that today she was no longer a mother begging for her son's affection. She was a judge passing sentence. She had removed David's name from the inheritance list of the large family she had recently rediscovered. The money, the land, the building, everything would be inherited directly by Leo under Grace's guardianship. David would not get a single cent. David roared, sobbing hysterically. It wasn't a cry of sincere remorse, but a cry of fear of poverty and prison. He tried to grab Mrs. Vance's feet, calling her mother, begging for forgiveness repeatedly, pleading to be freed from the police. He promised to change, to become a devoted son, but it was all too late. Mrs. Vance stood tall, pulling her foot away from David's reach. She turned her back, refusing to look at her pathetic son's face again. She ordered the police to take David away. "Take him away. Deal with him according to the law. I have no son who is a criminal," Mrs. Vance said coldly, closing the chapter of David's life as a free man. The police dragged David out of the building, accompanied by the scornful stares of hundreds of people who witnessed the downfall of a disobedient son. Grace watched her husband's back being dragged away, feeling a heavy burden lift slowly from her shoulders. Justice, even if bitter, was finally served. 2 months had passed since the party night that turned into a nightmare for David. Now his days were no longer filled with business meetings in five-star hotels or sitting in the plush chair of his air-conditioned office. David languished in a cramped, damp, foul-smelling prison cell. The concrete walls surrounding him felt cold to the bone, as if absorbing the last shreds of his life force. His expensive suit had been replaced by a drab blue prisoner's uniform that chafed against his skin. His hair, once neatly styled with expensive pomade, was now shaved bare, leaving a scalp full of scratches from fights with fellow inmates. His face, once clean and arrogant, was now gaunt. His eyes were hollow with dark circles, indicating he never slept soundly. Life in prison was hell for David. He was placed in a cell with hardened criminals, many of whom, it turned out, were familiar with David's scams on the outside. Some were henchmen of former business partners David had ruthlessly cheated. That revenge was exacted in the tightly sealed cell. Every night, David became the target of physical and mental abuse. He was forced to sleep on the floor near the dirty bathroom. His food rations were often stolen, and he had to serve the needs of his cell seniors if he didn't want to get beaten bloody. His shin bone, which Grace had struck, hadn't fully healed and was now worse from frequent kicks by his cellmates, forcing him to walk with a permanent limp, enduring pain with every step. That afternoon, the prison guard called his name loudly, echoing down the block corridor. "Visitor for you." David's heart pounded with hope. He thought perhaps his lawyer had found a legal loophole, or perhaps his mother, Mrs. Vance, had finally softened her heart and come to free him. With a limping gait and handcuffed hands, David was escorted to the visitation room. The sunlight streaming through the barred window was dazzling to his eyes, accustomed to the darkness of his cell. He sat on a cold iron chair, separated by thick glass from the outside world. His eyes watched the visitor entrance with anticipation, hoping to see his mother's face. But it was not Mrs. Vance who appeared. The door opened, and in walked a young woman, elegantly and simply dressed in a head covering. It was Grace. Her appearance was strikingly different from the weak woman he had driven out 2 months ago. Grace wore a neatly fitted pastel-colored long dress. Her face was clean and radiant, exuding an extraordinary calmness. In her arms, baby Leo looked plump, healthy, and was sweetly giggling, playing with the edge of his mother's head covering. The sight was so beautiful yet painful for David. He saw what he had so foolishly thrown away. Grace sat in the chair across the glass, looking at David with a flat gaze. No smile, but also no explosive anger. Her gaze was that of a stranger. David immediately pressed his hands against the glass. Tears began to stream down his dirty cheeks. He called Grace's name in a hoarse voice, begging for forgiveness. He proclaimed how much he missed Grace and Leo. He swore he would change. He promised to atone for all his mistakes if Grace would help him talk to Mrs. Vance to drop the charges. David debased himself to the lowest possible point, begging for mercy from the woman he had once trampled on. He tried to touch Grace's heart by reminding her of their past happy marriage, hoping there was still a shred of love in Grace's heart that he could exploit. Grace listened to all of David's rambling and crying without interrupting. She let David pour out all his false regrets. After David finished speaking, breathless, Grace calmly took a folder from her bag. She did not answer David's pleas. Instead, she pressed a document against the dividing glass so David could read it clearly. It was the decision from the family court and civil court, just released this morning. It stated that Grace's divorce petition had been granted by default judgment because David had been proven to commit serious criminal acts and domestic violence. David read the letter with trembling hands, but it was the next point that completely shattered his world. Grace pointed to the paragraph about child custody. The court had granted sole custody to Grace. Furthermore, due to David's crimes of attempting to harm his own biological child and his involvement in a drug planting scheme, the court had granted the request to revoke David's parental rights permanently. David's name was legally removed from Leo's birth certificate. In the eyes of the state, Leo now had no father named David. Grace explained in a soft yet firm voice through the intercom that she did this to protect Leo's future. She did not want her son to bear the shame of having a father who was a convicted scam artist, callous enough to abandon his own flesh and blood. David screamed hysterically, pounding on the separating glass with his handcuffed fists. He refused to accept it. He yelled that he was Leo's biological father, and his blood flowed in the child's veins. But Grace didn't flinch. She stood up, adjusting Leo's position in her arms. She looked at David one last time. Grace said that being a father wasn't just about contributing blood, but about love and responsibility. Two things David had never possessed. Grace ended the conversation by saying goodbye, not as a wife, but as someone who once knew David. She turned and walked out of the room without looking back, leaving David screaming her name until he was forcibly dragged away by the guard back to his dark cell. The iron door slammed shut with a loud clang, locking David in eternal loneliness. 5 years later, the wheel of life turned in mysterious yet just ways. The city was still as bustling. More and more skyscrapers soared, challenging the clouds. In one of the elite business districts, a magnificent office building stood solid with the name of a leading real estate company emblazoned on its front. On the top floor of that building, Grace sat at her CEO's desk. The past 5 years had transformed her into a respected career woman. Under the guidance of Mrs. Vance, who had now retired and peacefully enjoyed her golden years in a mountain villa, Grace successfully expanded the family business. She was known as a generous entrepreneur, often helping orphanages and establishing shelters for women, victims of violence, a dedication born from her own dark past. That afternoon, the city sky was once again covered in thick, dark clouds. Rain poured heavily, drenching the asphalt streets and creating puddles everywhere. Occasional lightning strikes reminded Grace of the stormy night 5 years ago, the night her life completely changed. But this time, she wasn't walking in the cold. She was tidying up files at her warm desk. The door to her office opened, and a 5-year-old boy ran in excitedly. Leo had grown into a very handsome, intelligent, and polite child. His face resembled his father's, but his eyes were gentle like his mother's. Leo urged his mother to come home because he wanted to have dinner with Mrs. Vance, whom he called Grandma, at home. Grace smiled, closed her laptop, and held her son's small hand. They took the private elevator down to the main lobby. In front of the lobby, A brand new luxury sedan was waiting. Their private chauffeur quickly opened the door and shielded Grace and Leo with an umbrella, preventing them from getting splashed. The car slowly glided through the city traffic in the heavy rain. Leo happily chattered about his school activities that day, while Grace listened with loving affection. Grace's gaze occasionally drifted out the window, watching people run for shelter. Their car stopped at a red light at a major intersection, directly in front of a famous upscale bakery. On the veranda of the bakery, in an area not well protected by an awning, an unkempt homeless man sat huddled, hugging his knees. His clothes were tattered, dirty, and soaked. His hair was long and unkempt, and his beard was matted. His body was skin and bones. On his bare leg, a long, gruesome scarred wound was visible, and his foot was bent at an unnatural angle, indicating a permanent, untreated deformity. The man extended his hand to passers-by, hoping for spare change or leftover food, but everyone turned away in disgust. Grace squinted her eyes. Although the man had drastically changed into a pitiful state, Grace recognized his facial features. The birthmark on his left arm, exposed by his torn sleeve, was clearly visible under the streetlights. It was David, her arrogant ex-husband. She had heard the news. David had been conditionally released from prison last week due to illness. His assets had been seized by the state and the bank. No family or friends would take him in. Chloe had long since disappeared, and Mrs. Vance had firmly closed her doors. David was now truly societal refuse, exactly like the words of insult he used to hurl at others. David, shivering from the cold, saw the luxury car stop in front of him. The rear window of the car slowly rolled down slightly. David's dim eyes widened as he saw the woman inside. He recognized Grace, and next to her, that handsome little boy. David knew it must be Leo. Late regret surged through him. David tried to stand up with great difficulty, dragging his limping leg closer to the car. He shouted hoarsely amidst the rain, calling out Grace's name, and proclaiming himself to be Leo's father. He hoped that after 5 years, Grace's heart might have softened. He hoped for at least a ride or some money. Leo, hearing the shouts, turned to his mother with a confused look. He asked who the dirty old beggar was and why he was calling his mother's name. Grace looked intently at David. There was no hatred, no resentment, only pity, as if seeing a helpless stranger. Grace stroked Leo's head and gently replied that the man was just a confused stranger. That answer crushed David's remaining hope. He was not acknowledged. He was considered non-existent. The traffic light turned green. Before the window closed again, Grace called over a bakery security guard standing nearby. She handed him a large denomination bill, but not for David. Grace instructed the guard to pick up a broken, discarded umbrella, one with broken ribs, usually left by the trash can beside the store. Grace asked the guard to give that damaged umbrella to David. It was a final symbolic message. David had once thrown Grace out into the rain without protection. Now, Grace was giving him protection just as broken as the protection David had once given her. The luxury car slowly drove away, leaving David behind. The confused security guard handed the tattered umbrella with torn fabric and broken ribs to David. David accepted the umbrella with trembling hands. He stood alone on the roadside, holding the broken umbrella that offered no shelter from the heavy rain. The rainwater drenched his body, masking the tears of endless regret. He watched the taillights of Grace's car, growing smaller and disappearing around the bend, realizing he had lost the paradise he once had, all for a moment of greed. Karma had completed its task, leaving David in eternal cold and loneliness.